Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another in the series Curating Culture. I'm Georgette McGlashan Miller, Education and Outreach Officer at the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, Jamaica Memory Bank. And today, as my guest, is Dr. Afua Cooper, and she'll be speaking with us under the theme The Jamaican Maroons in Nova Scotia, 1796 to 1800, 1796 and 1800, a quest for autonomy and formation of Black Atlantic subjectivities. The discussion will center around the history of the Trelawny Town Maroons and their Nova Scotian sojourn, which took place between 1796 and 1800. Dr. Cooper is a celebrated historian, poet, author, and public intellectual. She is currently Distinguished Professor of Black History and Feminist Studies at the University of Toronto. Her 13 books range across the genres of poetry, history, fiction, and children's literature. She is a recipient of numerous prizes and awards, including the SSHRC Impact Connection Award for Outstanding Research, the Portia White Prize, the J.M. Abraham Atlantic Poetry Prize, the Order of Nova Scotia, and the Bob Marley Award. Her book, The Hanging of Angelique, The Untold Stories of Slavery in Canada, and The Burning of Old Montreal, has been recognized as a Canadian classic. Afua Cooper was awarded the Royal Society of Canada's J.B. Tyrrell Historical Medal for outstanding contributions to Canadian history. Dr. Cooper has curated 10 exhibits, the latest, A History Exposed, The Enslavement of Black People in Canada, and this was recently on display at the United Nations, New York. Help me to welcome Dr. Cooper to the set of Curating Culture, who joins us online.
Thank you, Georgette, and your team for the invitation and for having this presentation live streamed. Is my voice loud enough?
I'm hearing you clearly, Doc.
Okay, thank you. And I want to thank everyone for joining in. It is my pleasure to make this presentation on the Maroons in Nova Scotia. Bear in mind, we know there's a long history of the Jamaican Maroons. I'm focusing on the Leeward Maroons, more specifically the one who came from Trelawny Town, as it was called. We know that, Maroons have been in Jamaica since the time of the Spanish period. So it's a long history of Maroons. Lots have been written on the Maroons, but not so much on the 4-year sojourn of the Trelawny Town Maroons in Nova Scotia. And that was the collective that engaged the British in what came to be called the Second Maroon War. It could be called the Trelawny Town War because only the Trelawny Town Maroons of the 6 or so Maroon communities on the island participated in that war in the sense of fighting the British colonial forces. Only the Trelawny Town Maroons. Other Maroons participated in other ways. People from Accompong and Charlestown participated in other ways, but not on the side of the Trelawneys. So, in 1796, about 556 Maroons from Trelawny Town, Jamaica, were transported from their island to exile in Nova Scotia. The cause of this transportation and exile was British imperial and colonial treachery, white supremacy, racism, and the commitment of the Jamaican planter class to the institution of slavery that existed on the island. Let us now examine this important aspect of Jamaican, African Canadian, Black Atlantic, British imperial history, and additionally, African history. The Maroons were African Jamaicans who lived in freedom for generations. In a slave society, they established free communities across the island. By 1733, these communities had coalesced into 6 major settlements concentrated in both the eastern and western portion of the island. The Eastern Maroons were called the Windward Maroons, while the Western Maroons were named the Leeward Maroons. Western meaning Trelawny, St. Elizabeth, um, St. James, and also Westmoreland. There's a big story there, but we're focusing on the Trelawny Town Maroons. By the way, Trelawny Town that time period was not in the parish of Trelawny, it was in the parish of St. James. It was called Trelawny Town after the then governor of Jamaica, Governor Trelawny, who was the governor at the time of the signing of the treaty of the First Maroon War, when Captain Kodjo was the leader of that particular community. It was called Kodjo's Town. And then after the treaty was signed in 1739, they renamed it Trelawny Town. So Trelawny Town had the largest number of Maroons, not only in the Leewards, but also on the island as a whole. In 1655, England invaded Jamaica and seized it from the Spaniards. The Spaniards, for their part, released many of their enslaved persons to fight the British by engaging in guerrilla warfare. These Africans also joined existing Maroon communities that had been established during the time of the Spanish period. And it was after this period, after 1655, at the time of the conquest, that a consistent documented history of the Maroons began. From this period onward to 1733, from 1655 to 1733, the Maroons engaged in warfare with the British, who sought to wipe out their communities and reduce them to slavery. But the Maroons, through the use of guerrilla warfare and the practice of building communities in almost impenetrable regions of mountainous areas, not only held off the British colonizers and slaveholders, but were able to successfully defeat, at the time, the mightiest army in the world. So the First Maroon War erupted in about 1733 when the British invaded Maroon territories. For 5 years, the Maroon held off the British, and the war ended with a peace treaty in 1739 for the Leeward Maroons and in 1740 for the Windward Maroons. The Windward Maroons really, in this case, meaning Portland. And so, the terms of this treaty is gonna be really problematic for the future of Maroon communities. In fact, the terms were problematic even then when Kodjo signed for the Leewards and Captain Quao signed for the Windwards. The treaty, some of the points of the treaty, that white superintendents, had to now live in each Maroon communities and sort of sought to Maroon justice. So these superintendents were going to, in some ways, subvert the authority of the captains, of the leaders of these communities. The Maroons had to engage in a road building campaign in the mountains and in accessible areas. So they were also transformed into allies of the crown. No longer would they be fighting the British colonial forces or authority. They would now be allies of the crown. And they signed that they would defend Jamaica from foreign invaders. And perhaps the most contentious point in both treaties, Windward and Leeward, was that they would assist the British in returning runaway slaves. Remember that the Maroon communities were places of refuge for enslaved people who ran away from slavery. No, they could not really do that anymore. The Maroons signed a treaty that they would not return them, and in fact, help the colonial forces to track down rebellious slaves. We know that happened in Tacky's War in 1760 and in the Samshar Rebellion later on, maybe 60, 70 years later. So the Second Maroon War, this one began in 1795 between the British colonial government, our local Jamaican colonial government, and the slaveholders, and the Trelawny Town Maroons broke out in the latter part of 1795. Trelawny Town was not the only Jamaican Maroon community, was the only, sorry, to rise up against the British in this war. The Trelawneys took issue with several conditions of the 1739 treaty. For one, as I mentioned, the British insisted that a white superintendent, or sometimes two superintendents, live among the Maroons in a supervisory capacity. The Maroons had agreed to this. Second, the Maroons also agreed to returning runaway slaves. A third point of contention for the Trelawneys was that land-hungry planters began encroaching upon and stealing the lands granted to them by the treaty or confirmed by the treaty. They were already living on these lands. The treaty confirmed them as owners of the land. The relationship between the Trelawneys and the white superintendents who live among them was a tense one. Furthermore, the Maroons hated the divide and rule strategy of returning runaway slaves. And so in 1795, in August, when some Maroon leaders went to the authorities in Montego Bay to protest the ill treatment of some Maroons in said city, they were slapped in iron and jailed. So the triggering moment, the story is that two Maroons from Trelawny Town had gone down to the bay and were accused of stealing pigs. They were shackled and beaten and whipped by an enslaved man. And it is said that this enslaved man previously had sought refuge among the Trelawneys and was returned. So he apparently took great pleasure in whipping them. So when the news reached Trelawny Town of this insult, they began a loud protest led by their formidable leader, Montague James. The Maroons took action by ousting the superintendent from their community, and the colonial government, for its part, under the intransigent Governor Balcarres, mobilized the militias to attack Trelawny Town, and later would have thousands of redcoats, redcoats are soldiers in the British Army, engage in an invasion of Trelawny Town. The Maroons, for their part, became war ready. They destroyed their crops, and took to the hills and mountains and forests where they launched guerrilla warfare. Of course, they sent the women and children in more secure locations. Remarkably, the Maroons held off a well-equipped British army. The British had modern weapons, thousands of soldiers, and also assistance from local militias. In the first 2 weeks of the war, remember this war began in August 1795, the Maroons killed 65 British soldiers or members of militias, while only about 20 Maroons were killed during the entire war. The Maroons, using guerrilla warfare, outwitted the British. Losing men and morale, the British sued for peace. The Maroons accepted. But here's another reason that the Trelawneys accepted the peace overture. General Walpole, who conducted the war on the side of the British, and Balcarres himself, Balcarres was the governor, pursued a burnt earth policy. This meant laying waste to Maroon farms and burning their villages. Walpole also cut off or compromised the water supply. The Maroons began to starve, even though the British were not fully aware of this. Some scholars remark that the principal reason for the acceptance of the peace overture by the Maroons was because Balcarres imported 100 bloodhounds and their handlers from Cuba. Unleashing these hunter dogs on the Maroons would have taken the war to a tragic dimension, and the Maroons knew this. They laid down their arms and accepted the peace treaty. Maroon historian Beverly Carey, in describing the impact of the war waged against the British, notes, and I quote Carey, the Second Maroon War, which lasted 5 months from August to December 1795, disrupted existing estate life and planter society, particularly in the parishes of St. James, Trelawny, Hanover, Westmoreland, and St. Elizabeth. It cost Britain a great deal of money, and the government of Jamaica had lost face Just a few hundred leeward Maroon fighters held off over 5,000 British soldiers. The war had only been brought to an end because a treaty had been forged. She said it cost Britain a great deal of money, around £500,000 to be exact. Aware that the planters wanted their land and would have exiled them from the island, the Maroons demanded that the peace treaty included a clause that guaranteed they would not be transported off the island. And Walpole really assured them that they would not be transported off the island. Remember, Walpole was the British general. The Maroons laid down their arms and began arriving in Spanish Town, the capital of the island at the time, to go through the terms of peace with Governor Balcarres. But Balcarres had this inserted in the treaty, was that all Maroons had to be present themselves in Spanish Town by January 1st, 1796. The war ended about December 20th. Now, Balcarres knew that they would not make it to Spanish Town. These people are walking in 10 days or so. So Balcarres took that to say, oh, they broke that particular treaty condition. And the Balcarres, spurred on by a planter-dominated legislature, betrayed the treaty and insisted that the Maroons leave the island. Remember, the backdrop to all of this in the wider Caribbean was the Haitian Revolution. And Balcarres was paranoid. The planters were paranoid. They were convinced that the Haitians had sent spies among the Trelawny Maroons to revolt and take over Jamaica. Nothing of that sort, but that's the kind of fear and paranoia the Haitian Revolution instilled in the white elite. In other words, white planters believed that if the Trelawneys remained on the island, the war would continue, and that the Maroons would, heaven forbid, incite the enslaved population to revolt. In the aftermath, and that quote is from Carey, in the aftermath of the treaty betrayal, the Jamaican legislature decided to send the Maroons to Nova Scotia and pay for their upkeep while there. 3 transport ships on their way to Britain were stopping in Halifax, and the Maroons were herded onto them in the harbor Port Royal. Thus, in 1796, the 3 ships, the Anne, Dover, and Mary, arrived in Halifax with approximately 556 Maroon children, men, and women. There were more women than men, by the way, in this community, and the largest cohort of this community comprised of children. 2 superintendents, Quarrel and Hutch Trelawny, and 1 surgeon, one Dr. John Oxley, accompanied the Maroons on their journey to Halifax. The Jamaican legislature also provided £25,000 to the Maroons to ensure their upkeep while in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia was a British colony in the North Atlantic. It was and is the indigenous territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. It was first colonized by the French, but between 1758 and 1760, during the 7 Years' War, Britain successfully conquered the territory from France. Halifax was a relatively new capital of Nova Scotia when the Maroons arrived. So, according to Kenneth Bilby, a Maroon historian, in one of his publications, he talks about Maroon people singing as they left Jamaica. They felt really betrayed by Balcarres and they were heartbroken. Wish you well, oh Maroon, wish you well. Wish you well, oh Maroon, wish you well, ma. Me yari war a cholan. Me cry out hooray, Maroon de ya. We no go home, we no go home, we no go home. Fear thee well, O Maroon, fear thee well, fear thee well, fear thee well. Them raise war a St. James, fi cry out hooray, but Maroon they are. We no go home yet, we no go home yet. And this is from Ken Bilby's article, The Treacherous Feast. The Jamaican settled in Halifax and its surrounding towns. So briefly, they had the Nova Scotia to which they came to was a society in which the racial order was firmly in place and blacks were at the bottom, firm at the bottom of this racial order. It was a society in which the enslavement of Africans was institutionalized, meaning there was a slavery there. This was in 1796 when the Maroons arrived. In 1792, a cohort of black people who were called the Black Loyalists, 1,200 of them left Nova Scotia and New Brunswick for Sierra Leone because of the racism they endured. They left. Imagine 1,200 people jumped on 15 ships and said, "We're out of here. We're not going to deal with anymore." After 9 years, this cohort, the Loyalists, had fought for the British during the Revolutionary War with the American colonies. War ended, they were transported to New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, also to Ontario and Quebec, but in this case, New Brunswick and Ontario. And they faced re-enslavement, they faced all kinds of degradations. And in 1792, they left. So 4 years later, the Maroons arrived. And I'll come to what the province of Nova Scotia and the British imperial government in England, what they thought the Maroons should do in Nova Scotia. So they settled in Halifax and surrounding towns, places like Chocolate Lake and Spryfield. And it's 1796, so the Anglo-French War was going on. So there was this fear that the French would invade Nova Scotia, would invade Halifax. So the British command at the time of the Imperial Naval Forces was none other than the Duke of Kent, who was to be the grandfather of Queen Victoria. So he was impressed with the Maroons. He noted that they were, strong and brave. He knew that they had just come from a war fighting the British in Jamaica. So there was a little, he didn't rush and embrace them with open arms because they always feared that the Maroons could revolt against them in Nova Scotia. Nonetheless, the Duke of Kent formed the Maroon men of, fighting age into militias, and they were pressed into service to in fortifying in Halifax this fortress called the Citadel. So if you go to the Citadel now, it's this big fort in the middle of Halifax. There is a bastion that they called the Maroon Bastion. This was the third iteration of the fortress, and the Maroons worked on that part. So if you go there now, there's this presence there in terms of the Maroon Bastion. The Maroons also worked on the construction of Government House, which is the official residence of the governor of the province. In addition, the Maroon men built provincial highways and roads, canals, and public buildings in Halifax and Dartmouth. Halifax and Dartmouth are twin cities. They are on either side of the harbor. So Halifax is on the Atlantic Ocean. You come through this sort of sheltered harbor. On one side is the town of Halifax or city, on the other side is Dartmouth. So the Maroons were employed in building a public infrastructure on both sides of the harbor. Later on, they were moved from Halifax proper to Preston. Preston is a township in Dartmouth, to a property brought for them by Governor Wentworth for £3,000. Remember, the Maroons had brought £25,000 with them from Jamaica, given by the Jamaican government for their upkeep. So they built new cottages and they lived in cottages that were formerly used by the Black Loyalists, who I said left and went to Sierra Leone. The Governor Wentworth was very enthusiastic about the Maroons being in Nova Scotia. He hired a missionary, he placed a missionary among them, and he established a school for the children. However, the Maroons were not happy in Nova Scotia. For one, they did not choose to go there and were incensed at Balcarres's betrayal. The Maroons were under the authority of the colonial government, that is the Nova Scotia colonial government, headed by Governor Wentworth. And I said he looked at them favorably and he saw them as a replacement labor for the Black loyalists who had fled the colony of Nova Scotia 4 years ago. The departure of the Black loyalists created a labor shortage. And so they were to come in as this reserve army of labor and, take up the work for white people, work on their farms. The Maroons, however, refused to become the replacement agricultural labor force. The idea that they would work for white farmers was anathema to them. They argued that they had their own farms in Jamaica and were forcibly taken from them, and they did not want to work for anyone. They did not want to be replacement labor. So this vision that Governor Wentworth had for them and the folks in London, the Duke of Portland had for them as is, they're going to come from Jamaica after fighting the British forces and come to Nova Scotia to become laborers for white people. And the Maroons were not having any of it. Because you see, they were not to be integrated as regular settlers or desirable settlers. Roma Chopra notes that they could be assimilated not as neighbors or marriage partners, but rather as permanent housekeepers, construction workers, and servants with little chance for advancement as landowners. So the idea was floated that they themselves, the Maroon, could become farmers for themselves, but they shouted down that idea. They said the Maroon cannot live where the pineapple does not grow or where the pineapple could not grow, which is a depth analysis of the unfavorable climatic conditions for agriculture or settlement and their oppression under British imperialism. This metaphor of the pineapple cannot grow in Nova Scotia. Therefore, we cannot live in Nova Scotia. We're coming from the tropics. On the point of conversion, there was also the pressure for the Maroons to convert to Christianity, in this case, Anglicanism. They also refused to do so, but continue in their traditional Jamaican, West African religious practice. Most of the Trelawny Maroons believed that baptism would cut them off from their African traditional culture. Exposure to Anglicanism had not resulted in fundamental changes to Maroon beliefs and practices. And this is from Mallory Shorts, who wrote a report on the Maroons. And Shorts note that the Maroons continue to practice polygamy, identify the creator as Yanking Pom or Tatanyame, community ancestral spirits in ceremonies with music, fire, drums, dance, and ritual possession, known as chromantic play, and mark the passing of community members with traditional funeral rites involving chanting and burials on the mounds of stones with rum, tobacco, and food for the afterlife. And they said they were not going to give that up. If they converted to Christianity, then that would really cut them off from the ancestors. Maroon men also practiced polygamy and refused to give up that practice. Now, I'm going to read here just one line from Andrew Smith. Andrew Smith was a Maroon captain, originally from Westmoreland, but he was allied with the Trelawnys. And he has a brother, or had a brother, Charles Samuels, who was residing in England. And Andrew, he writes to his brother and he says, "You know I have 4 wives and 8 small children, beside our father, old Tor Williams, and our mother, sisters. And we have plenty, and there's only you and Cope and myself to maintain 18 or 20 people." So he was really commenting that the pressure of such a large family. An extended family was a lot for him to bear in Nova Scotia. But I noted, spoke out clearly and plainly, I have 4 wives. So one of the things, they refused to give up polygamy. The missionary would preach to them about giving up polygamy. And sometimes the Maroon men would go to church only to engage in theological discussions with the pastors. So they would say, "Oh, you want me to give up my wife? Do you love David and Solomon?" And of course, the pastors would say, "Yes, we love David and Solomon." And they said, "Well, King David and King Solomon were polygamous. Solomon had 1,000 wives, David had 5." So the one missionary, he said he could never win an argument with the Maroons because they were very sharp. They were always on their toes, and polygamy was not something they were willing to give up. Now, I mean, from the get-go, in 1796, right back to 1800, when the Maroons left for Sierra Leone, they engaged in letter writing and petitioning to all the 3 governments that we're talking about: Jamaican government, Nova Scotia government, and the British Imperial government at Whitehall. They did not cease. They wanted to leave Nova Scotia. It was too cold for them. The first winter was just horrendous. They wanted to return to Jamaica. Of course, the Jamaican government did not want them back on the island. And so they wrote to the relevant authorities in England. They wrote to Governor Wentworth in Nova Scotia. And Montague James, one of the prominent leaders, he even sent an emissary to London to plead the cause of the Maroons, like, "We want to leave here." In 1799, the Duke of Portland, the Home Secretary, agreed to the removal of the Maroons from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone. And in 1800, the ship named the Asia, September 1800, left Halifax for Freetown, Sierra Leone. The Trelawny Maroons now began a new chapter of their life. But not everyone left. A few families remained. The Colley family, for example, which was headed by a woman named Sarah Colley, she had a son for Governor Wentworth. Of course, Governor Wentworth was married, so you're thinking of those people wanted the Maroons to give up polygamy, but here you had the very married governor having an affair with a married woman, not with a married woman, with a Maroon woman, and that affair produced a son. The Colley family remained in Nova Scotia. Now, I want to look at identity formation and gender dimension. In the Jamaican experience, the Jamaican time of the Leeward Maroons, they were a close-knitted community. There was great cohesion among the families. Many chose to travel to Nova Scotia with their families even when they were not on the deportation order. And I think that's important. If a mother knew her son was going to be exiled from the island, she would join the party. Wives would join their husbands. They had a strong sense of self and a strong sense of community. The men at least, were also warriors. Their identity was rooted in this martial experience. In Nova Scotia, they probably became closer knit. They were in a majority white dominated colony, and they were sometimes at the mercy of colonial and imperial authorities. Of course, again, there was great cohesion among the families. They resisted this idea of resisting the authority was sort of part of their DNA. In Nova Scotia, they reaffirmed their allegiance to the British Crown. When you look at some of the letters and petitions that they wrote, they always talk about, "We are loyal subjects. We're loyal to the Crown. We're worthy subjects." They were adept at politics. Look at the petitions and the correspondence with Whitehall and with General Walpole, who had now gone on to England. The gender dimension. There were more women than men in this community. Probably that was the reason for the practice of polygamy. Maroon history has been told largely as a male story, one that highlighted the military prowess of the men. But let us pause for a minute to think about what a community would look like when women are in the majority. Women would definitely take part in decision-making process, in child rearing, and in socialization of children. And women did some of the agricultural work. A group of the Maroons had split off and gone to a new community called Boydville. And we know in Boydville, Maroon women grew vegetables, which they sold along with poultry, eggs, pigs, and brooms in the nearby market. So while in the Nova Scotian context, the Maroon community may have had a public face, much of the internal dynamics and even economic dynamics to some degree were female driven. Jeffrey Fortin has, he notes, Jeffrey Fortin is one of the historians on the Maroon experience. The Trelawny Maroons illustrate the complexities and meaning of freedom on the margins of empire in the Atlantic world. Their Black identity meant that any freedoms often gained hung in the balance as an increasingly diverse British Empire attempted to sort out notions of freedom, citizenship, and racial cultural realities. In pleading their allegiance to the crown, the Maroons positioned themselves to take full advantage of changing conditions, such as being removed to Sierra Leone. Even existence as a police force to troublesome Blacks in the empire reasserted the limits of their freedom. On the margins, they were not as free as white people or as whites, yet they were not as limited as other Blacks. Should I go on, Georgette? I see that there's 1 minute 30. Okay.
Well, Dr. Cooper, I'm being told that we should just prepare for the break. Yes. So, what you've discussed so far is very interesting, and I hear you calling the names of all the sources that have written about Maroons. Of course, Kenneth Bilby, Beth Carey, and I also was reading this article by Morgan Van Eyck that was talking about better to die than life in Nova Scotia. So that article spoke mostly about the point you were at about the women and children that were a part of the sojourn to Nova Scotia. So that is going to be an area that we'll speak about when you complete the presentation about the impact and the influence that women had among the Maroons, seeing that their numbers were more than the men. And I would also want you to get into some more about the children as soon as you complete. Another thing that was very interesting is that for many of us who didn't know about the sojourn to Nova Scotia, is that the Maroons were writing. You know, we thought that it would have been probably an enslaved position, seeing that many saw this as punishment, but that they had some kind of confidence in Governor Walpole. And there was also the conversation, there was an argument among the British about the climate being suitable. Walpole saying that it's too cold for them, seeing that they're from the tropics, and you gave the metaphor about the pineapple. And Wentworth saying that, oh, as long as they are well fed and they have proper clothing, that it will work, and even providing proof in court that see, the Maroons are gaining weight. They are healthy. They look okay. So the climate wasn't an issue. Van Eyck also mentioned that when the trip to Nova Scotia wasn't originally destined for Nova Scotia, that they were originally supposed to just stop over for a while and go to Sierra Leone. But when they got to Halifax, as you said that they were there to replace, people started thinking that, oh, they could replace the workforce from the Black loyalists. They ended up just staying there for a while. So many times we don't know the entire story. So we really appreciate all this information that you're sharing. And also, I know people will be sending questions about the Maroons and the role that they played in helping to return the enslaved to the British from the islands and now having to endure something like this in Nova Scotia. So you could continue now, Dr. Cooper. Turn on your camera. I think we just lost your camera there. Can you hear me? I think you're muted as well. Well, thank you to our online audience for staying with us. We are just putting together the rest of the presentation. You know how technology is. But I'm sure we can all agree that this is a very timely conversation. And for your questions, you can just type them in the chat. So when Professor Cooper is ready, she can answer them adequately and address a concern, as well as if you have information you like to share with us about Maroons and what you've encountered yourself. As you know, at the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, we are the custodians for intangible cultural heritage, and the Maroon communities are part of our indigenous community. And that's what make a lecture like this fitting. Dr. Cooper, are you ready for us again?
Yes, I'm ready. So can you hear me? Okay, sure. Thank you. So yes, so living in Nova Scotia for almost 15 years afforded me the opportunity to delve deeper into the Maroon story. You know, when you're a Black person and you go to a place like Nova Scotia, Black people talk about the Maroons, African Nova Scotian. You'll hear people say we're descended from the Maroons. But maybe if not by blood, since almost everybody left and went to Sierra Leone, but certainly in terms of, ancestral spirit and vibe, the Maroons are known as people who resisted the colonial order, who they were determined to have a say in their future. Like I said in my notes here, they really didn't have a say in Jamaica, whether they were going to go or stay. Balcarres made sure that they were turfed off the island. In Nova Scotia, they were determined that they would have a say in their future, hence the letter writing campaign to England and to Halifax itself, and also to Jamaica to some degree. The Maroons think of them as world-traveled people. Here you're in Jamaica, you're moved off the island, now you're in Canada, and now you're in Sierra Leone. So they develop lots of skills, just more than survival skills, political skills in their sojourn around what is now called the Black Atlantic. So as I said, I teach Black history in Canada. I taught about the Maroons. I would take my students to Citadel Hill, the fortress that the Maroon helped to build, the British fortress. I would also take them down to Government House. Government House is the mansion or the official residence of the lieutenant governor of the province. And the Maroons started to build the foundation for Government House before they left in 1800. So the British authorities in Nova Scotia tried to assimilate them. The Maroons resisted assimilation. They created a really strong community. It didn't mean that there weren't fractures in the community. There were fractures. We could talk about that later on. They went to Sierra Leone in 1800, and unfortunately for the Black loyalists who were there before and who had rose up in rebellion against the British, the Maroons arrived just in time to help the British put down the Black loyalist rebellion in Sierra Leone. So I will say that they sought as best as they could, this is the Maroons, within the limits of the British imperial processes to create an empowered life for themselves. And we know that many Maroons returned to after emancipation happening in Jamaica in 1838, two Maroon ladies that we know of bought their own ship and sailed to Jamaica and went to live in Flagstaff. And even after that, many Maroons or their children and grandchildren went to Jamaica to work as indentured laborers because the British always needed labor for their plantations. So this story always fascinated me as a Jamaican living in Canada and in Nova Scotia. And in 2018, I wrote a letter to a publication. It's called A Monument for the Maroons, and really asked a question that the Maroons' history resonated so much in this place of Nova Scotia. Why isn't there a monument for the Maroons? In 2019, I wrote a letter to Historic Sites and Monument Board. This is the board that does the commemoration. And in suggesting that the Maroons or recommending that the Maroons be commemorated. And then on August 1st, 2024 rather, a plaque was unveiled for the Maroons at Citadel Hill in Nova Scotia. And I will stop there. It seemed, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. It says your screen sharing has been paused. So
Very much, Dr. Cooper, for such a full presentation. You used up all the time. You're not running out of time. It was a lot of information. And I hope our viewers online have noted the points that they would like more information about the Maroons. I have a couple talking points, not necessarily questions, that I would want you to expound on. And from my own reading about the Maroons, during the break, I mentioned Morgan Vanik. Not sure if you came across that person that I've been reading about outside of Kenneth Bilby and Bev Carey that wrote about the Maroons. I think the name of the article is Better Death in, was it Better Death in Somewhere Than Life in Nova Scotia? Better Death Than Life in Nova Scotia, I think was the title of the article. And it was talking about the climatic conditions that the Maroons were not loving at all when they first came to Halifax, and they were trading themselves off to say that we would prefer to die and you send our women and children to Sierra Leone. If all of us can't go, save our families and we will fight in your wars. So I was happy when you started to mention women and children, because many times we think about Maroons, we only think about the men fighting, the fighting men. And probably if we think about a female, we think about Nanny.
yes.
But what I was surprised to hear that most of the Maroons that left Trelawny Town and went to Halifax were indeed females.
Yes. Can you hear me, Georgette?
I'm hearing you. I'm
Yeah,
hearing you
okay.
clearly.
And you're seeing the screen
I'm seeing you on screen still.
and the slide?
And I see what you're sharing.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yes, so absolutely. Most of the people were children. I have some notes here as to the amount of men who were there. Yeah, women were in the majority, and like I said, even the paintings that we have, there's this painting of this one here, like the men in white, the Duke of Kent. He got uniforms for the Maroons, and by the way, they were paid. The men were paid the same rate as white men. That's 9 pence a day. But again, if you look at this painting, it depicts men, right? When we know about 201 people were women, 321 were children, and 133 were men when the war concluded and people were loaded on the ships to Sierra Leone. So it was a woman-dominated society internally, maybe public facing. The men, because the governor and the Duke of Kent and all those people, they would want to talk to men. but it's the women who were holding the communities together. And like I said too, the women engaged in economic activities, making brooms, selling eggs in the market, chickens, and so on, to help to make ends meet. And so I think there's more work that needs to happen in that area, looking at the gender dimensions with a focus on women and also on children. With respect to children, as I've said, Governor Wentworth was the governor of Nova Scotia at the time, established a school in Preston for the Maroon children. And interestingly, while the Maroon parents did not want to go to church and convert to Christianity, they sent their children to school. So that's a form of assimilation, and they're kind of looking to the future too. Like we know we're gonna need to learn to read and write if we want to be able to manipulate the system. So they sent their children to school, and even Governor Wentworth came, and the children recited all kinds of, British sort of rhetorical speeches. So yes, the children were going to school, and the women were very much, even if they were in the background. But if you're selling in the market, you're not really in the background. But they were very much part of um, what the glue in my estimation that was holding the communities together. Now, on the point about where were the Maroons to be sent, the person who asked the question is absolutely right. Balcarres did not know. He just wanted them off the island. And there were these three ships waiting in the harbor that were going to Nova Scotia. But there possible other places were proposed. So, for example, the Bahamas, Honduras or British Honduras, Lower Canada, which is Quebec, Upper Canada, which is Ontario, and also Sierra Leone. So when they arrived in Nova Scotia, it was like, yeah, they're gonna stay here because we have just lost 1,200 loyalists. We need the Maroons to beef up the laboring population.
One of the things I know persons definitely, they're always having a discussion about the loyalty of the Maroons to the rest of the enslaved versus the British. And the arguments are yes, they were freedom fighters until they started to fight for their own freedom. But here we see now they're in Nova Scotia, where they don't really have that choice to make. They
Yes.
don't have slaves to return. They know are trying to return themselves to a
Yeah.
more, you know, a climate that is better for them. So there is a metaphor of the pineapple cannot grow here. And then I'm wondering, why did some of them stay if they're now getting to move out of this horrid cold climate to go to Sierra Leone? And I mean, this is really the Black Atlantic. This is full circle. So it's from Africa to the Caribbean to Canada to Africa again.
Yeah.
Why do you think are some of the reasons that some people decided to stay?
Some people decided to stay because they had established ties. And earlier I mentioned there was a rift in the Maroon community. Some people under Captain James Palmer, moved to this place called Boydville, which is now it's renamed Sackville. There's a place there called Maroon Hill. And so there's a big blow up between these two factions. So they took themselves away. They went to Boydville, and they didn't want to go to Sierra Leone because they had established themselves. They were doing cattle farming and sheep farming, and they were, really making the best of the situation. So people like them had established themselves in a way. They didn't want to leave, and they had beef with the other faction. And in fact, when it was decided that everybody's going to go to Sierra Leone, when England decided that, the Boydville people, the breakaway faction, they wanted a separate ship. Um, they said, we don't want to travel with the main body. We want our own ship to go to Sierra Leone. Of course, that didn't happen. They all went on one ship. But that's to show there was faction in the community. Some people had said, you know what, Nova Scotia not too bad. We think we can stay and make it work. But the vast majority of people did want to go. Now, on the point of this tension, if you will, about with the Maroons in Jamaica, and then it also, that kind of activity also played out in Sierra Leone. Returning runaway slaves, that was, yeah. And, when you look at the literature on Maroons across the Americas, people said that the cockpit Maroons, who are the Leewards, and the Portland Maroons did not debate that clause too much because they had gotten weak. By the time the Second Maroon War concluded there in St. James, the Maroons were weak. The British didn't know this. And so they signed that clause. If you look at the Surinamese Maroons, for example, in their wars with the Dutch, when the Dutch proposed to them that they also become slave hunters and return runaway slaves, they said, hell no, we're not doing that. But you see, the Surinamese Maroons were operating from a position of strength. They were in the swamps, they were in the wilderness. The Dutch had to treat with them. They held the upper hand. In Jamaica, especially during the Second War, this was not the case. When Balcarres decided to bring in the hound dogs, it was kind of like over, and they signed that treaty. But it was classic British divide and rule strategy. And yeah, that's I feel that's a discussion that must be had, and I know it's been had else, in circles, in different circles, but it's something that must be had and that must be talked about. Having said that, though, during the Second Maroon War, this one that we're talking about, it convulsed the western part of the island. So many people ran away from slavery. So many people, formerly enslaved people, ran to the Trelawny Town Maroons and fought with them against the British. A compound didn't fight with them. A compound actually fought against them. But hundreds, if not thousands, of people ran away from St. Elizabeth, Westmoreland. Westmoreland also had satellite Leeward Town Maroon communities. And so many, many people actually gained their freedom because of this war, because they ran away and established, many of them established. There's a place called Congo Town in St. James that were established independent of the Leewards. So this is, part of imperial history, part of imperial treachery, because now you set two communities against each other. Of course, the enslaved community is gonna be resentful. Of course, when you think of the Maroons were used to track down some of the leaders and slave soldiers in the Sam Sharp War or even in the Taki Rebellion, it is gonna cause a lot of resentment. But when you look at people in the different spaces where they are in their different contexts, then you see the whole multidimensional nature of their existence. In Nova Scotia, it was a different scenario from in Jamaica or also in Sierra Leone. So this is the unveiling of the plaque in on August 1st, 2021, 2024. That's me there in the blue
Yes.
scarf. Uh,
Question from someone online who is
sure.
asking if the story of the Maroons in Nova Scotia is well known among Canadians.
I wouldn't
Is
say it's
this a
well known.
story that's just niche, or does it form any foundation of that community?
It formed the foundation of the Black community in Nova Scotia, the longtime Black community from the 17th century. It does form a foundation. In terms of storytelling, in terms of how people see themselves as descendants of the Maroons. Like I said, if they're not descended in blood, then they're descended from spirit, because most of the Maroons did go to Sierra Leone. So it's known in those communities. In terms of the larger Canadian historiography, no. I'm always surprised when people say, I've never heard of this before. And even when you look at the work of people like Price and Bilby and all those people who write on the Maroons, they seem to not remember. that the Trelawneys came to Nova Scotia. I mean, people like John N. Grant, who wrote a book called The Maroons in Nova Scotia, is certainly a pioneer in this regard, in putting the lens on the 4 years, and people like Roma Chopra, scholars like Chopra, who wrote a recent book on the Maroons. And I just want to say this. The Maroons resisted assimilation and acculturation in Nova Scotia. Talk about looking at people in the context where they are. Yet, when they arrived in Sierra Leone, in Freetown, Sierra Leone, look, it's 1808. St. John's Maroon Church, which I had the opportunity to visit. There's a church. It's called the Maroon Church. It's a Methodist church. So within 8 years now, they are going to church. They're assimilating. They have built their own church. And that's why I find history so fascinating.
We have another question from our online audience, from a Jeanette Campbell. You mentioned persons, two women, that bought ships and sailed back to Jamaica. Jeanette is asking if we know of anyone that came from Sierra Leone back to Jamaica, any Maroons.
Yeah, these two women were Maroon women, and they sailed from Sierra Leone, not from Nova.
Are the ones that came from Sierra Leone, not
They're the
Nova
ones.
Scotia.
I'll send you their names, Georgette. It's
What is the question they're asking? They're asking about their descendants. They're asking about their descendants. If
yes.
we can contact, if we have any contact with their descendants in Jamaica now, if we can trace that lineage at all.
You mean to the people who are at Flagstaff
Yes.
in Maroon Town in St. James?
Yes.
I'm sure there's someone did a documentary on that community. That community left St. James and went to Sierra Leone, maybe in 2013, to visit. You know, the Maroons who came from Jamaica via Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone, they became part of a community called the Creoles or the Creoles, which consisted of the Maroons, the Black Loyalists who had left earlier, repatriated Africans, as they were called, or liberated Africans rather. And these liberated Africans were people who were taken off slave ships. Remember, the slave trade ended in 1807, the British version of it. And so the British Navy began to patrol the Atlantic and would seize slave ships. And many of the victims on these slave ships were actually taken to Freetown, Sierra Leone, where they lived and fused a community with the Maroons and with the Black Loyalists that became known as the Creoles, kind of Anglo in orientation, Christian in orientation. And so the Maroons became part of that community. So they first had this big clash with the Black Loyalists in 1800, but over time the communities merged as one. And you know, the Maroons, you and their descendants, you find them everywhere in West Africa, all the way down to Fernando Po. They are very proud to have established themselves as professionals, as lawyers, as doctors, as school teachers. And from this group, they went all over West Africa. Some of the early magistrates in places like Ghana, Nigeria, and the Gambia came from this community, and among them were Maroon descendants. So it's a story that we keep telling, because it's a story that's not yet over. When you are looking at this big picture of Black freedom in the Atlantic world and worldwide.
You mentioned the Creole. Professor Cohenberg is here, leaving a comment online saying that there's a good bit of linguistic work that was done on the dimension of the relationship between Jamaican Maroon language and Sierra Leone's Creole by authors such as Nova Smith, Magnus Huber, and John Singler. So she's commenting on the linguistic dimension as well of the
Yes,
relationship. Yeah.
of course. Thanks
I
to everyone.
I have another question. From someone online again, it seemed that your crowd is here, Prof. It says, how did the numbers of enslaved Africans in Nova Scotia compare with the numbers of Maroon who arrived? And do we know what relationship existed between the two groups?
Yes, the Maroons arrived in 1796. Slavery was still legal in Nova Scotia. We still have newspaper accounts, talking about my slave so and so has run away and is seen lurking about, this particular place. So slavery was still a fact in Nova Scotia. Were there relationships between these two bodies? I don't know. I can't say for sure. I mean, the Maroons were saw themselves as a special people who were in Nova Scotia for a brief sojourn. They were sure that they were going to leave, and they did leave. Um, and so they were more concerned about their own well-being and upkeep. Like I said earlier, Nova Scotia was a society in which Black people, in terms of the racial order, Black people were firmly at the bottom, whether these were free Black people. Like, not all Black loyalists went to Sierra Leone. About 2,000 remained in Nova Scotia, and they had a hard time. They really had a hard time. So when you look at the hardship, the initial hardship of the Black loyalists who went to Sierra Leone and the Maroons, and see how they fared, and the kind of professional success they had in the British colonial Sierra Leone, you do not find a similar situation in Nova Scotia at all. The racism there was blistering. Whereas Nova Scotia, even though they fought with the colonial government, there was more space for them. Not in Nova Scotia, in Sierra Leone, there was more space for them to maneuver. It's not a question I can answer conclusively. It does demand more research.
It's very unfortunate now that when the Maroons from Trelawny Town, when they do arrive in Sierra Leone, they are now fighting against these same Black loyalists, the same divide and
Exactly.
conquer. I think that
Exactly.
is the unfortunate situation.
Yes, because the Maroons, this an identity that they took on to themselves was that we are subjects of the crown. We are your loyal subjects. We are here to do your work, because they were looking out for themselves.
I was
And
just going to say that's how
yeah,
they survived. And I mean,
yes,
I can't say that's a Maroon thing, like that's a human thing.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I say you just have to look at each specific situation. Because they said, we're loyal to you. Remember the Treaty of 1739? Those treaties, when the Maroons basically decided that they were going to be a police force for the British on the island. And arriving in Sierra Leone, they did that too. And the Black loyalists were very disappointed, because they saw the Maroons as fellow brothers and sisters coming from the other side of the Atlantic, just like them. But the Maroons were looking out for themselves. They wanted to have some control over their future. And so if the Sierra Leone experiment did anything, really, it was to kind of meld them in with the other group. They became one. They became one people after a while, with the Black loyalists and with the so-called liberated Africans who came as far south, as far from Angola up to Sierra Leone, and lots of people from Nigeria. Yeah.
Okay. So as we come to a close, Doc, I see someone here asking about contacts for international team of Maroon attorneys in Jamaica and the diaspora. Maybe this is something we can talk about off camera, um, because they're concerned about Maroon lands. That has always been an issue as well, about Maroon keeping their lands, maintaining their lands from the treaty and the argument of sovereignty, you know, because some people are not very clear what that means in regards to the peace treaty and what the Maroons are able to do in terms of their freedom, how free and how much leverage they have to move.
Yes. Yeah. And many scholars talk about this. So you sign the treaty and you become allies to the crown. But whenever the crown want to move against you, the crown moves against you.
Right.
They chased or exiled the Trelawnys, who, maybe in 1739 signed a treaty with them that, you would treat us with respect. Anyway, the war did happen. And what the British did with the Trelawny Town land was basically to sell that land. They sold the acreage of that community. And so that's another reason. Even if the Trelawny's were to be returned from Nova Scotia, where would they have gone? Their land was sold, or what was left was taken up by the planters. So it was a big loss, still a huge loss. There are people now in Flagstaff who are reviving that memory of those who went off to Sierra Leone. And like I said, people return to Jamaica, Maroon people return to Jamaica from Sierra Leone, not in great numbers, but enough to be noticed. So and I know right now on the island of Jamaica, there's this issue of sovereignty and land and treaties with the crown. We did not sign treaty with Jamaica. We signed treaty with the British crown. And should those treaties be held up? I mean, similar thing here too in Canada with the indigenous people. The province of Alberta, there's this discussion about they're going to break away from Canada, and several indigenous leaders, they'll say things like, yeah, we didn't sign treaty with the province of Alberta, we signed treaty with the British crown. So there's always this, the crown comes in. Is the crown going to do well? And where are the limits of, and does the national state, is the national state sovereign enough?
Right. So
It's
there are lots more discussions to be held, to be had. But we just want to thank you for coming on Curating Culture, Dr. Cooper. It was a very good discussion. I know that there will be questions that will be in the chat after we're done, but we will forward those questions to you offline. So
okay.
let me just address our online audience now. Thank you for staying with us for Curating Culture. And just a few housekeeping matters that you can follow us at ACIJJMB on all social media platforms. And we have an upcoming art exhibition in collaboration with UWI Mona Library and in Africara. That's the PJ Patterson Institute of African Caribbean Advocacy, and this art exhibition is dubbed Kotla, an African art exhibition. This will be in September. It will be launched September 14th to October 16th. Stay tuned. We'll be sending out the flyer via our social media platforms and via our mailing list. Also, we're inviting you to come down to the African Caribbean Institute to visit our library. We currently have an exhibition titled Campaigners for Freedom. We are located at 10 to 12 Ocean Boulevard. And you can visit our audiovisual collection, an extensive library, our Jamaica Memory Bank collection, with audiovisual information, with interviews from some of Jamaica's most influential centenarians, can I say, and prominent people. And also, if you have a centenarian in your family that you'd like for us to interview and capture some memories, please let us know. We can get that interview for the Jamaica Memory Bank. And a note from my producer. Where can people go to contact you, Dr. Cooper, and to learn more about this work on the Maroons? You have 13 books. Oh my God.
Yeah, the best way to contact me, I guess, is through my email, which you have, Georgette. Yeah. Yeah.
For those who want to contact and for the questions about the Maroons and the lawyers and the legal issues.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much. So until next time, audience online and Dr. Cooper, join us again for Curating Culture, where we curate to educate. Thank you. Stay on a minute, Doc. Don't leave.
Oh, okay. Okay.